just to confirm, can you see my presentation well?
Yes, it's perfect.
Excellent, thank you very much. So, no man is an island, neither practical work is, a case study into undergraduate life sciences. The most common answer you get when asking educators about practical work is that many find it impossible to think about science education without practical work, stating that it is an essential part for effective teaching, or practical work is just what scientists do. So as someone who has come into the field of education from a biomedical research background, I find myself particularly interested in how best to use hands-on science to inform students about scientific ideas. So what is the problem then? Whilst a big part of the literature has been concerned with practical work in secondary education, there has not been enough research on the impact of practical work in teaching at the university level. So moreover, there is a lack of empirical evidence on how practical work contributes to the understanding of science and development of skills during their studies. So apart from being financially more expensive than other methods of teaching like lecturing or demonstrations, practical work requires a lot of time and effort. Financial resources are invested in equipment and consumables, in training laboratory staff, and going through the usual bureaucratic procedures concerning ethical clearance and health and safety. So all of the above should at least carry advantages that outweigh lecture-based science teaching. And in addition to that, practical work contributes to the increase of tuition fees for international students between degrees of science and those in social sciences. So we truly need to question what is practical work for. So discussions on the purpose of practical work, according to Miller, despite 200 years and more, if I may say, of debate, have ended up being morphed into a Newton's cradle, if you like, swinging almost indefinitely between ideologies and approaches. It started from the development of skills, focusing on the development of skills, then to discovery, learning, and heuristics from Armstrong, then to skills, and then again to concepts. They say that it is impossible to have an ideal Newton's cradle because one force will always conspire to slow things to stop, and that is friction. It will arrive at a standstill. So after decades of debate, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought the science education community into that exact standstill with regard to the purpose of practical work. So initially, it focused on skill development, and then now, again, universities focus on skills because they cannot explain what is practical work for. So does it have to be hands-on? The COVID-19 pandemic's restrictions forced both members of staff and undergraduates population to temporarily adopt remote learning and prevented access to the laboratory. So this has provided the science education community with a real-life scenario, perfect in this case, for teaching science without practical work and its effects on the learning process. Now it's time for the truth to see what is practical work actually for. So it is argued that practical work promotes understanding of scientific concepts by allowing students to visualize theory. However, there is a big difference between doing a practical activity and understanding it. A practical task without proper guidance can leave students confused, leaving the lab with misconceptions that can affect their learning instead of supporting it. So indeed, studies showed that when students were tested using pen and paper exams, there was no evidence of conceptual understanding. And of course, it will be totally unrealistic to expect conceptual learning to be directly attributed to just performing practical tasks in the laboratory. Students at the end of the day understand what they want to understand based on their prior conceptions. However, in comparison to traditional lecture-based classes, some studies concerned with undergraduate practical classes reported that practical work was indeed helping them learn and that their experience was enhanced with practical classes in comparison to traditional lectures. Practical work has been considered as being important in helping students understand theories and develop skills for future employment. On the other hand, we know that a big percentage of STEM graduates do not really work in their fields, but use their degree-related skills into different occupations. So for this reason, the goal of promoting practical work for enhancing skills for a career is questionable. However, they choose to study a science-focused degree, and that's what we as universities are offering. At university level, lecturers expose undergraduates to processes and equipment seen in industrial laboratories. However, it is impossible to expect that all machines will be the same, so they will have to relearn everything from scratch. That is true, but at least we are exposing them to what an industrial clinical laboratory looks like and to techniques that will actually help them get incorporated in the industry later on. And it doesn't matter if the equipment that we offer is not really up to date. They will know the methodologies behind those processes. At the same time, there are claims that observation skills are developed with practical work. But this is questionable since undergraduates need to be in the right conceptual mindset in order to understand what they're seeing. We are usually exposing undergraduates to recipe-style experiments, and they do not really understand that those experiments are not realistic and they do not demonstrate what experiments look like in the real science world. However, those recipe-style experiments were advantageous in this project, and the research findings from this study will explain it later on. So the main objective of this study was to focus on finding answers to the main research questions. In terms of effectiveness, this research was looking on whether practical work is effective in enabling students to learn and do what the lecturer intended. So only with extended research, we will be able to have a clear picture of the effectiveness of practical work, and only by observing actual laboratories, we will be able to see the reality of what is really happening in those laboratories. So this research was conducted exploring the effectiveness of practical work in undergraduate student science, conceptual understanding, and skill development in the chosen University School of Life Sciences for year 1 and for year 2. Okay, so this research was a case study getting an in-depth, detailed understanding of how practical work was being undertaken in the School of Life Sciences at year 1 and 2, as said before. The quantitative part involved a pre- and post-questionnaire at the beginning and at the end of the semester, respectively, so that undergraduates could state their expectations of what laboratory work should be like for them and whether those expectations at the end of the semester had been fulfilled. The qualitative part involves laboratory observations where students were observed doing technical procedures and were asked questions related to the experiment in order to see whether they have an understanding of the procedures and the theories behind their experiments. The data collection involved lecturers' perspectives on practical work and their main objectives for the practical work class observed. So this presentation and paper presents preliminary findings on observations about conceptual understanding and skill development. So given the wide variety of practical work, it was decided that effectiveness had to be approached not in general terms, but in terms of how effective a specific task is in relation to the aims of the lecturer who chose it. And in order to do this, a model developed by Miller and successfully used by Abrahams and Miller in a secondary school setting was used. So this model evaluates the effectiveness of a task, and it consists on 2 levels, as you can see on the screen. First, the lecturer needs to decide the learning objectives and what undergraduates should learn from the practical task. Then, the activity that will enable undergraduates to learn what is intended needs to be decided. The next level of the model takes us to what students actually do, as this might be different to what members of staff were actually expecting. The last level of the model talks about what students actually learn as a result of the experience during this practical. This is then linked to Tipper-Guillen's model of linking the observables with the domain of ideas. This will help us identify what do lecturers focus on during a practical task, whether they focus on developing scientific knowledge or scientific skills. So the aims of practical work depend on the way the chosen School of Life Sciences runs the curriculum and structures practical work lessons. So from a previous publication from myself and a colleague, this table presents the top 3 aims for each year based on surveys provided to 14 members of staff in the department where the research was conducted. Giving training in problem solving was ranked as the most important for year 2 and year 3. The most important aim for year 1 was the promotion of simple, common sense scientific methods of thought. The same aim was ranked second for year 2. Finding facts by investigation and arriving at principle was amongst the most important aims for year 3. Year 1 focused on the development of skills and scientific thought. Year 3 on problem solving and critical thinking on scientific facts observed. Year 2 included a combination of year 1 and year 3 aims, demonstrating an in-between transitional period. So the majority of practical work lessons focused on skill development, with undergraduates learning how to use lab equipment, execute tasks on protocol, and develop understanding of the scientific approach to inquiry, something that was in line with the top 3 aims for year 1 and year 2 that we saw before. Undergraduates were successful in demonstrating such abilities and were able to generate data the way members of staff intended them to, after being explicitly guided, and this is important to keep in mind. So in the majority of practical work lessons, undergraduates were mainly engaged in expository cookbook-like activities. Therefore, members of staff were given teaching space and time to scaffold undergraduates during those experiments. However, undergraduates could not observe the outcomes or effects intended without assistance from members of staff. Skill training was prioritized for preparing undergraduates for their future careers in the industry, and was actually treated separately from data collection, as skills were observed to be developed through repetition throughout the year and with staff supervision, regardless of whether undergraduates had correct data or not. And this indicates that development of skills happens gradually. And even when undergraduates did not have the correct results, undergraduates will assist them with a sample from another group of undergraduates so that they could explain what the results were about. So even though practical work lessons observed were linked to underlying scientific theories, the importance of scientific ideas to carry out the activity well was not important. Neither was the development of scientific knowledge, and this is important to keep in mind, in the laboratory while doing practical work, as it was not regarded as part of the departmental aims of doing practical work. So introductory discussions before the experiment helped undergraduates understand the rationale behind their experiment, and this was reflected in the fact that 17 out of 18 lessons undergraduates could explain what the activity was for and why they were doing it. However, there is less evidence that undergraduates could think about their observations using underlying ideas on their own. The connection of observables with theoretical ideas is challenging, and the connection is indirect, so assistance from members of staff is crucial. This study has been unable to demonstrate that practical work as an activity on its own can aid in the better understanding of science theories, but based on the set aims, this was not expected. Undergraduates cannot think without being scaffolded by members of staff, at least not in year 1 and year 2, where they're still training in acquiring skills, correctly observing and thinking scientifically. An adequate understanding of ideas ranging from 50 to 88% was only observed in 4 out of 18 practical work lessons for both year 1 and year 2. So practical work lessons were conceptual understanding of 50 to 88% and recalling of observations of 50 to 75% of the class was demonstrated through the linking of observables and ideas, and included the following lesson characteristics. So in those lessons, introductory discussions on experiments, purpose, and scientific ideas were incorporated. Confirmation of observations at the end. The class size was actually small, ranging from 40 to 52 undergraduates, whereas in the previous observations, the class size was around 100 undergraduates. So this seems to play a vital role in how members of staff actually manage the class. And most importantly, scaffolding and probing from members of staff was crucial. Practical work was effective in helping undergraduates develop manipulative skills and promoting simple scientific methods of thought. Undergraduates, however, did not have a better understanding of scientific ideas. And again, this was not expected of them based on the perceived aims of practical work discussed by members of staff in the department where the observation was conducted. Coming to the title, no man is an island, neither practical work is. And actually, it is really unfair to treat practical work like an all or nothing activity. The laboratory serves as a teaching medium and does not directly promote theoretical understanding of sciences as a standalone practice. So practical work is a part of a bigger learning zone where the development of ideas is a result of reflective processing of performance during experiments and information acquired from lectures and self-studying. So the laboratory can be regarded as a Vykotskian learning zone of proximal development, where more knowledgeable experts guide undergraduates through scaffolded practical work from point A of being novices with limited knowledge to point B, where they have developed skills and a better understanding of the topic they experiment on. Practical work can also be regarded as the starting point of a bigger learning zone of proximal development. So at the end of practical classes, undergraduates can reflect on those experiences and can reach a more advanced level where they can process information by self-studying, and that information can be synthesized as part of an assessment. So when writing a reflective laboratory report, undergraduates can get the ideas from self-studying and lectures, as well as their experience and reflection from the laboratory, and they can self-scaffold themselves in order to reach that level B, where they will be more knowledgeable on what they did in the laboratory. Thank you very much. You can read more about this research from the paper published in the conference proceedings, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.